We have the right to self-government, to self-determination of land. And the people that are here are going to go back and continue to struggle. This is not an end, it's only a beginning.
Hello. Welcome to this episode of The True Canadians, the podcast. I'm your host, David Walenko, and the podcast is based on the book by the same name, which I wrote with Métis writer Patricia Russell. That opening you heard was Jim Sinclair at the 1987 constitutional negotiations in Ottawa with Prime Minister Mulroney, who recently passed. And we have the good fortune today to be here in Ottawa, nearby where those negotiations occurred, with the current president of the Métis National Council, Cassidy Caron. President Caron, welcome.
Thank you so much, David.
Of course, being here in Ottawa, we want to talk with you today about things that are going on up on Parliament Hill, legislation that's of great significance to the Métis. But everybody is always so very curious about you in particular, getting to the position that you're at such a very young age, following in a great Métis tradition of some real big hitter heroes over the course of the last 200 years who've accomplished great things at such a young age. But I understand that your family's actually from Batoche, but you grew up in the BC area. So perhaps you could share a little bit of that experience with us and how that led you to becoming interested in taking up politics.
Sure. So, yeah, I am a very proud Métis woman. My family comes from the historic Métis communities of St. Louis and Batoche, Saskatchewan. Batoche, Saskatchewan, of course, being a very significant and sacred place for Métis people with the Battle of Batoche, the resistance led by Louis Riel. It's now a protected site by Parks Canada, and if you've had the opportunity to travel to that area, you'll know that there's only one homestead that still stands on those grounds, and that's actually the homestead of my great-great-grandfather. And so my grandmother was born and raised just down the river, the South Saskatchewan River, on the banks of the South Saskatchewan. She's a Boucher, and the Boucher family was one of 5 families to first settle in that area. So I have a lot of history in Saskatchewan. Very proud to have come from there. Of course, though, my family moved to British Columbia before I was born to find work to be able to raise a family. And so I was born and raised in Rossland, BC, raised by a strong and proud line of Métis matriarchs. I was raised by a single mother, Anna Karen, and my grandmother alongside my sister. And so Métis matriarchs have played a significant role in my life. I'm a very proud Métis woman. What's interesting about growing up in BC as a Métis person, though, is that, it's a rare story for Métis in BC to always know where you come from. But I was really fortunate to have been raised to know that I was Métis, to be connected to who I was, to know that I came from Saskatchewan and from some very significant historic times and families, and was very grateful to have been raised in my culture with my traditions and to be able to be connected back to Saskatchewan as a child, going back and forth to see family and spend time out on the land there. My family has always been involved in politics. We're a very political family, very civically engaged, as Métis people are. My mom always raised me to be someone who wanted to contribute to our community, to our nation. And I was fortunate enough to always stay connected to community wherever I moved throughout the province. So when I was born and raised in the small town of Rossland, connected to the Kootenay South Métis community, I was then doing my undergraduate degree on Vancouver Island and very connected to, the contemporary Métis communities that exist out there. That's when I was first exposed to some of the work that Métis Nation British Columbia was doing as the Métis government for Métis citizens in BC. I stayed very connected, very involved. Following my undergraduate degree was actually when I ran to serve for Métis Nation British Columbia. I served as the provincial youth chairperson and minister responsible for youth on Métis Nation British Columbia's board of directors from 2016 to 2020. And it was during that time that I had a lot of exposure to the work of the Métis National Council, the work that was happening throughout the Métis Nation, the connections that each of the Métis governments were making with each other to build a strong nation. And that's how I was first exposed to the work of the Métis National Council, and really did become interested in contributing to the larger nation building efforts that were taking place.
And who's been on the board of directors? But in 2016, how old were you then when you were on the board of directors? That is amazing.
Yeah, I was quite young. Of course, I still am relatively young. I elected to this position as the president when I was 29 years old, which is still considered a youth within the Métis Nation. And as you mentioned, the Métis Nation has a history of uplifting and supporting young leaders. Louis Riel being 24 when he led the first provisional government. Cuthbert Grant being quite young as well. So we have a history of young people being involved throughout our nation's history, and I'm really proud to carry that tradition forward.
So I'm very curious to ask you, a lot of our listeners would be keen to hear your account of your election. I mean, we watch, most of us see these sorts of things on television, elections, premiers, prime ministers, leaders, presidents. Not everybody gets a firsthand exposure to that sort of thing. Not everybody's in the room when these things are occurring. But this did happen in person. So it was, I get, was it during COVID? Or
It was definitely still during COVID, less of the height of COVID. It
yeah.
was when travel restrictions had lifted, but COVID was still very much a concern when we had the election in 2021.
So what did that feel like? That must have been an extraordinary moment, I mean, and for you and for the Métis as well.
It certainly was. I never had aspirations to become the Métis National Council president. Honestly, even the month before the election, I didn't have aspirations to become the Métis National Council president. But being so connected to the Métis Nation my entire life, building relationships across the Métis Nation homeland throughout, my young adulthood, I was able to understand the need of the Métis Nation in that specific time. The Métis Nation has evolved so much, over generations, over decades, but our Métis governments have evolved at such a rapid pace over the last 10 years. And I saw the work of the Métis National Council when I sat at the Métis Nation British Columbia Board of Directors, and I saw how critical it was to facilitate a space where our Métis governments could come together to collaborate, to continue building a strong, thriving Métis Nation. But unfortunately, there was a number of situations that had led to, what I saw as the Métis National Council not evolving at the same pace as our Métis governments. It was no longer meeting the needs of our Métis governments. So in the summer of 2021, there was, of course, talk that there would be an election for Métis National Council president. Having the connections that I did across the Métis Nation homeland, we were talking amongst ourselves, asking ourselves, I wonder who's going to be put forward, who's going to be nominated, who will put their name in the hat. And those conversations took place throughout the months of July and August. And every now and again, somebody would give me a phone call and say, people are talking about you. They want to nominate you for this position. And so, of course, I had to take that to my family and my community and my elders and ask them what they thought about it. And so I found myself in Saskatoon in September of 2021, the day before the election, when we had conversations with some of the leadership and my nomination was confirmed. It was, again, something that I did not have the aspirations for, but when you think about, situational leadership, there are situations and specific times when skills and values are needed in a leader. At that time, the leadership of the Métis Nation saw it in me that, I'm someone who would work with all of our Métis governments to build a Métis National Council that would work for our Métis governments and not against our Métis governments. And, it was a fascinating election where, we had 3 names on the ballots. We went to 3 ballots. The first one of the candidates was removed after not having enough votes. The second ballot actually was a tie, 2020. And it was
Wow.
myself and Gerald Morin, who has served in this role before and served as president of Métis Nation Saskatchewan, done a lot for our people. And so him and I had a tie vote, and then some time takes place. There's some deliberations that happen amongst the leadership, and the third vote came through, and I was successful in that election. So that was 2.5 years ago now. A really extraordinary moment, being the youngest Métis National Council president, the first elected woman to serve as the Métis National Council president. Of course, President Audrey Poitras, past President Audrey Poitras, was the interim president of the Métis National Council for some time, and served in this position, paved the way for a woman like me to have this position. But to be the first elected woman to this role, to be the youngest, was certainly an honor. It still is an honor to serve in this position, and I'm really proud of the work that we've done to date.
You mentioned the members. For those in our audience who are not of Métis descent, the Métis National Council effectively represents the provincial nations. That's correct?
So the Métis National Council, so we are the national and international voice of the Métis Nation. We've been in existence since 1983, right following the amendments to the Constitution where Métis were included in Section 35. We receive our mandate from the democratically elected Métis governments of British Columbia, Alberta, Saskatchewan, and Ontario. And so they form the Métis National Council. Those presidents sit on my board of governors, and I receive my mandate from them to advance the issues and priorities that are important to them at the national and international level, and really serve as an advocate and a lobbyist here in Ottawa for them.
You mentioned Section 35, and that's from the Constitution Act of 1982, which is often referenced and by Métis and by Indigenous and Inuit, but may not be as well understood or known to a non-Indigenous, a colonial audience. But it is the reason for the book, The True Canadians, the 40th anniversary in 2022 of the Métis being recognized in the Constitution of 82. I'm very curious from your perspective. There are Métis elders that we've talked to for our podcast who, were actually even there and at that time. What does it mean for you? Because there was the Constitution Act came into force under Pierre Elliott Trudeau with the Queen, Parliament Hill, just a couple blocks from here, 1982. But then there was a long period when others have told me not a lot happened. And then there was the Powley case that went all the way to the Supreme Court, which seemed to be quite a milestone. And then as you mentioned earlier, in the last 10 years, things seem to have progressed. Is Section 35 even today? Is it really that significant to what's happening? And we're going to talk about legislation after our break, to what's happening currently in terms of the Métis cause in Canada.
Absolutely, it is. It's foundational. I mean, as Métis people, we have inherent rights in this country tied to these lands as one of the first peoples of these lands. Section 35 and the recognition of Métis in the Constitution serves as a foundation for us to continue building upon to find our rightful place within the Federation of Canada. It's the impetus for the creation of the Métis National Council as well. It was a number of Métis leaders were fighting for the inclusion of Métis within Section 35 of the Constitution in the early 80s, and preceding that through different bodies, the Native Council of Canada included. But it was after 1982 when Métis were included in Section 35 that Métis leaders decided there needs to be one distinct voice for Métis people at the national level. And that's why the Métis National Council was created, and that was just 41 years ago. And so, Section 35 happened, and it's been since then that we've been trying to unpack what that really means. We talk about, our history as Métis people. We talk about how we used to fight our battles on the battlefield. Now we fight our battles in courts. And it's been through the court system that we've been starting to unpack what Section 35 really means, how we actually implement that and find that rightful place for Métis within the Constitution, within this country. And that's been the role of the Métis National Council over the last 41 years. The Métis Nation for years has been organizing and advocating, negotiating, and litigating to advance Métis rights. And the Métis National Council has been alongside that fight for the last 41 years, supporting our Métis government's fight for that respect and that rights recognition, working towards advancing the Métis Nation's cultural, social, economic, and political interests. And it's been the Métis National Council supporting our Métis governments to advance the interests and priorities of Section 35 rights-bearing Métis people. So that's why the Métis National Council exists. That's why we continue to exist, because of course there's still a lot of work to be done as we move forward as a Métis nation, a nation that's situated within the nation of Canada.
Yeah. One of the things that's so striking is this idea that something passes Parliament, but then it seems as though, despite all the effort and work that goes into that, and pages of laws and interpretations and legalese and so on, it seems like somehow they always end up passing it off to the courts to decide, what did this really mean? I always find that so striking. And so often it'll be a government that'll appeal something like Powley all the way to the Supreme Court, and then the Supreme Court's decision will be unanimous. Like, what did you not get about the legislation? I find that remarkable. But we'll talk about that after the break, about some current and very significant legislation happening. But you've now been at the job 2.5 years. You just mentioned about 41 years as an organization, last year being the 40th anniversary. What so far in your experience has been interesting, disappointing, exciting, that you found surprising, or anything in particular in these 2.5 years that you'd like to emphasize?
So 2.5 years feels both like it's gone by in the blink of an eye, but it also feels like it's been a decade, because of the amount of work that we've packed into 2.5 years. So it's been an incredible 2.5 years doing this job, serving for my people, serving for my nation. When I took over leadership of the Métis National Council, like I had said, there was a significant need to evolve the Métis National Council to meet the needs of our Métis governments instead of working against them. There was a need to rebuild relationships amongst, our Métis governments, with our Métis people, rebuild relationships with the federal government, rebuild relationships with our First Nations and our Inuit relatives as well. There was a need to rebuild the office of the president and understand what that role is as the national spokesperson. And ultimately, what I saw a need for was a need to build an institution that respects Métis democracy. Métis people have always valued democracy, building our systems and our institutions around it. And there was a need to ensure that that was institutionalized within the Métis National Council. So when I took office, we had less than a dozen staff at the Métis National Council. There was not a lot of foundation, I would say, as an organization. And 2.5 years later, we have built an institution that has the respect of the federal government, that has the respect of our Métis governments, that has rebuilt relationships with national Indigenous organizations like Inuit Tabari Kanatami and the Assembly of First Nations. We have rebuilt trust with Métis citizens to ensure that this is an institution that is transparent and accountable, and one that our Métis citizens can be proud of. And we've done all of that work because it is the right thing to do, because there is a need to have a national body to be that one voice for the Métis Nation. Of course, there's a lot of division across the Métis Nation, and that's been probably the most disappointing thing that I have faced throughout the last 2.5 years is division that exists and continues to exist amongst Métis people. I would say, I think about our ancestors, and I say this every Louis Riel day, that I can't help but think that he would be disappointed in the division that exists across the Métis Nation. But as a young person in leadership, I hold out hope that we can reunite the Métis Nation one day. That is what our ancestors want. That is what our elders want. That is what our young people want. And unity across the Métis Nation is exactly what is needed to continue to move down a path of building a strong and prosperous Métis Nation. So all of that to say, 2.5 years has gone by in the blink of an eye. There is a significant amount of work left to do, but I am incredibly proud of the work that we've done to date.
You remind me, and some of our listeners may not be as aware, that there's a huge, deep-seated tradition for the Métis in democracy. And democracy is a messy business, isn't it? It doesn't always go smoothly. But as Winston Churchill said, the late great Prime Minister of Great Britain, it's the best of all the bad systems. So anyway, great place to take a break. We're here with President of the Métis National Council, Cassidy Caron. We'll be right back.
Hello, this is Audrey Poitras. Métis National Council has been a very important part of Métis history. Established in 1983, Métis National Council was all about bringing the 5 provinces together to ensure that we had a strong voice at the national table. It began with 3 founding members, Alberta, Saskatchewan, Manitoba, with Ontario and BC to become part of Métis National Council a few years later. The purpose of Métis National Council was to ensure items that were national in significance we would all be able to have input into. And it did its job. It became a very strong body for Métis to meet with governments, to try to make sure that people would start thinking about our position in the Canadian Confederation. We had some good years where we certainly moved the yardsticks forward. We also had some challenges along the way. But all in all, I believe that we all knew, in addition to being very strong within our provinces, it was important to have a national body. For years, our leadership battled, negotiated at those national tables to have our voices heard. More recently, we were very successful in being able to actually get on the Canadian agenda to talk about some of those very important things for our Métis people, whether that was education, housing, health. It took some time, and by 2014, we were having finally discussions to start looking at the importance of having Métis-specific programs for our citizens. All during that time, we were still trying to have people understand the importance of self-government. And over the last 6 to 7 years, we have made major progress in signing framework agreements with Canada and signing specific housing agreements, education agreements, early learning and childcare agreements with Canada in order to better support our citizens. We went through some challenges at the political level, but today we have a young Métis leader, Cassidy Caron, who's doing amazing work in making sure that she is at every government table where we need to be. I believe that there's a lot more work to do, but I believe we will continue to move forward, and she has certainly been one of the key people in helping with the negotiations of Bill C-53 and the legislation.
And so we're back with President Cassidy Caron of the Métis National Council in Ottawa. President Caron, you were speaking just a moment ago about, what it's felt like to be the president here for 2.5 years, and how it felt like you've had to pack 10 years of activity into 2.5, and yet it's gone by so quickly, which is probably what it feels like when you're in a leadership position, because it seems like you're just going from one thing to the next thing, the next thing, the next thing. You're probably always saying, what's next, and when do you get a break? When can you sort of reflect a little bit? But maybe that's what this is for, is a moment to reflect. You mentioned earlier the last 10 years, quite a lot has occurred. There's been some major breakthroughs with the Métis in Ottawa. Perhaps you'd like to just sort of describe some of that and what you feel has been of most significance.
I would say one of the most important documents that we have guiding the work of the Métis National Council. And this is, of course, I talk about important documents, sure, Constitution and Section 35, important document to have. Our self-government agreements with the Métis governments signed between our Métis governments in Canada, very important documents. But in 2017, the Métis National Council signed the Canada Métis Nation Accord with the Government of Canada, with the Prime Minister. That Canada Métis Nation Accord has been a long time coming. Of course, the first Canada Métis Nation Accord was talked about, was discussed, was negotiated in 1992. It was going to be part of the Charlottetown Accord, which of course did not pass with the referendum. But in 2017, the Métis National Council signed the Canada Métis Nation Accord, and it set up processes in which we can work as a nation with the Government of Canada, that nation-to-nation, government-to-government relationship. It set forth a process where we work with the federal government on a nation-to-nation, government-to-government basis. And we call it the permanent bilateral mechanism. It's a mechanism in which we meet with the federal government. We meet with the Prime Minister once a year to identify joint priorities between Canada and the Métis Nation. We then meet with the ministers who are the leads of those priority files throughout the year. And we work towards, closing socioeconomic gaps. We work towards building a strong Métis Nation at that table. It is a critical process that the Métis National Council facilitates with our Métis governments. We've seen a number of successes through the permanent bilateral mechanism, including 10-year accords that include sustainable long-term funding in the areas of housing, early learning and childcare, post-secondary education. And now we sit at this table and we've really revitalized the permanent bilateral mechanism in the last 2.5 years. We use this table to talk about these priorities, to try to make progress on these priorities, and to hold the Government of Canada accountable to really understanding what it means to work with the Métis Nation. One of the most critical successes that we've had with the permanent bilateral mechanism over the last 2 years was the endorsement of our principles of co-development. These principles of co-development really set out how we expect the federal government to work with the Métis Nation. We are not just an organization. We are not just, a nonprofit organization, a nonprofit society. The Métis Nation is a nation, and Canada needs to understand that when they're developing legislation, when they're talking about programs and services, they need to be co-developed with the Métis Nation to ensure that the needs and the unique experiences of Métis are taken into consideration. We won't move the needle on closing socioeconomic gaps, on building that prosperous and strong, thriving Métis Nation unless we're at the table with the federal government making progress on that. So that's been a milestone. That's been a success that we've seen over the last 2.5 years. And the other one that has been extremely important revolves around the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. Of course, Canada enshrined UNDRIP in legislation in this country, recognizing that this is an international instrument that is important to our people. Just this past June of 2023, we tabled the UNDRIP Action Plan alongside the Minister of Justice, alongside our colleagues at ITK and AFN. And that action plan lays forth the plan for implementing UNDRIP in this country. And that was a significant undertaking to understand, what are the first priorities for us as we try to implement this international instrument in this country, and what does that mean to the Métis Nation? What does that mean to Indigenous people together? So the UNDRIP Action Plan was a significant milestone as well. We now have, the task of implementing the action plan, identifying those priority areas that we want to be working on. Of course, the negotiation of self-government and the passage of that legislation is included in the UNDRIP Action Plan as one of those actions that needs to be taken to work towards the full implementation of the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. And that is something that will continue to uphold our rights, and that is a tool that we will continue to use But I think those are two significant milestones that we have achieved here at the Métis National Council over the last 2 years.
It's good to hear that that's current. And the reason I say that is because people often look at these, these agreements, these accords as sort of a moment in time, kind of like an isolated thing. And that's not the case. What you want it to be is is a living document. And of course, that the UNDRIP, led to the Truth and Reconciliation Commission chaired by Mary Sinclair, which had, several calls to action, which have been forefront of the media in the mainstream, the Bay Street media, all media in Canada for quite some time. So it's really great that you can see the influence that that's having. It's interesting. You mentioned about the Accord, and you mentioned the 1992, and of course that was Prime Minister Brian Mulroney, who's recently passed away, and he held those constitutional talks because of the Constitution Act of '82, which called for them by Prime Minister Trudeau. Now we have Prime Minister Justin Trudeau, and you have this. It's kind of almost like coming a full circle, and yet it must always feel like a Back to the Future sort of situation for you, right? Where you like, do you feel like you're just making incremental bits of progress, or do you feel like we're really headed somewhere, and this Accord and UNDRIP, as you were talking about, are putting us on a path to I would like to say a renewed relationship, because people that understand history know that the Métis had a strong people all those hundreds of years ago. Does it feel like that's something you could get back to because of initiatives like what you've just described?
Yeah, I feel like it's both incremental progress, but I also feel like we are taking leaps forward at the same time. I think what's most important is that it's so important to understand our history. It's so important to understand those milestones that have occurred over the last 40 years, and to understand that it does feel as though we are repeating history with these conversations. But it's so important to continue talking about those pieces too, so that they are relevant in people's minds. We're going to talk a little bit about self-government. We're going to talk about the legislation, Bill C-53. What's most important for me when we're talking about that is that these are new conversations, and we meet with parliamentarians, with members of parliament here in Ottawa, and we have a role to play in reminding these individuals that this isn't new. We have to tell them the stories of who we are as Métis people, of the steps that have been taken to get to where we are today, because there's uh, unfortunately a somewhat of a case of systemic amnesia that happens here in Ottawa, where people don't understand that these conversations have happened before and that this isn't new. So it's important to remind, Canadians to always look back at history and find those moments in our history where we've talked about making this progress. But I do feel like we're getting there. And again, this could be my youthfulness shining through, and the hope that I do have for the future. But incremental steps are steps nonetheless, and we are taking them, and we are making progress.
I'm not Métis, and one of the things I've learned from working on this project with Patricia, is that history is so deep. So I grew up in Fort Garry in the south end of Winnipeg. I mention this often on our podcast and even on the blurb about me and on the book. Well, that community was built in the 1960s, and that's kind of where Fort Garry began. Well, not really. It was more like 100 years earlier, but we didn't know about that. We didn't learn about it in history class. We didn't study it. I still have my high school history book, Challenge and Survival, so I can show people that there's maybe like one page about Louis Riel. I didn't know Riel House was just across the river in St. Vital. So there is a colonial amnesia. I think that's a very good way to put it, and I don't think it's an unfair way to put it, and I think a lot of people would appreciate that. And one of the things that's happened recently, just to take a little sidebar for a moment, is that up here on the corner on Wellington Street is what was the U.S. Embassy, and it's become an Indigenous center. And Patricia and I, thanks to your team, had the great benefit of doing a book event on July 1st in the Métis area of that building, and it's extraordinary. Maybe talk a minute about that. Is it purely symbolic, or is that something that could, move the dial forward because it was open on Canada Day and people could go in there and they could learn about Indigenous history, about the First Nations, about the Inuit, and about the Métis, and maybe that'll have more than a symbolic significance in the future.
Yeah, so the building, it's at 100 Wellington Street here in Ottawa, directly facing center block of the Parliament. That building was gifted by Prime Minister Trudeau to the three national Indigenous organizations, Métis National Council, Inuit Tapiri Kanatami, and the Assembly of First Nations. Um, we've only in the last year or so really revitalized the space to ensure that it is something that can be utilized by, our Métis governments, the Métis National Council, but also open to the public. The building at 100 Wellington, sure, it was a symbolic gesture to gift that building to the three national Indigenous organizations. But when you're thinking about changing the country, I always think about there's symbolic change, there's substantive change, and then there's systemic change. And you can't just jump to systemic change. You need to take incremental steps. And even symbolic change, symbolic gestures are important in creating and facilitating the change that is required to have an impact on our future generations. And the space within the parliamentary precinct, when you're standing in that second room boardroom, you are facing directly to center block. It's powerful. It provides a space for First Nations, Métis, and Inuit within this parliamentary precinct, and it really says that Métis, First Nations, and Inuit have a relevant place within Canada's federation. And that's powerful. So while a systemic gesture of gifting a building within the parliamentary precinct, you could say it's just symbolic. It has a lot of power to it. It has a lot of impact. And, I'm looking forward to continuing to work alongside ITK and AFN to really develop the space more fully. I believe this summer we will have it open to the public to drop in, to come and learn about who we are as Métis people. There is an interpretive space for the Métis Nation for, not just tourists coming through Ottawa, newcomers coming to Canada. It's important for everybody to understand the history of the Métis. Our country has failed at telling that story in a good way, and your book contributes to a gap that exists.
Thank you.
And I think that having this space at 100 Wellington will also contribute to closing that awareness gap of who the Métis people are. And we look forward to having it open, to having tours throughout the space, and to developing it more fully as something, like I say, to continue down the path of having the recognition of First Nations, Métis, and Inuit as equal partners in Confederation. We need to have that, and having our own space within the parliamentary precinct is one of those steps.
Absolutely. Wellington is right down, the heart of Confederation. You've got the Peace Tower, as you point out, the center block, the hallowed halls of Parliament with the river behind, and you've got this building right looking straight on, and there's a transparent likeness of Louis Riel. And if you look at it the right way, the way it was designed, there's a window right behind, so you can actually see his image right against the Peace Tower. It is like a piece of history just right before your very eyes. But also just down the street from there is the Supreme Court, and we hear so much about the courts, especially in America these days. So we're going to end off talking with you about a couple of huge pieces of legislation. This Bill C-92, it was actually passed, I believe, in 2019 as the Act Respecting First Nations, Inuit, and Métis Children, Youth, and Families, which, it would be nice to say this is as far in the opposite direction of residential schools as you could get, but you're going to tell us if that's true or not. And it just had a challenge, a constitutional challenge against this bill was overruled. The bill was upheld unanimously. What's the significance of that for the Métis? It only happened a matter of weeks ago.
Yeah, it was a decision that we were waiting for some time. It was unfortunate that it had to go to the Supreme Court, that it was challenged first by the province of Quebec, and then all the way up to the Supreme Court, because it's delayed the progress that we could have been making on C-92 throughout that time. But Bill C-92, so the Act Respecting First Nations, Inuit, Métis Children, Youth, and Families, is a really innovative piece of federal legislation that was co-developed with the Métis National Council. It was co-developed with the Métis Nation. So really innovative. There's only been a few pieces of legislation that have been co-developed with Indigenous peoples. And so we were really extremely pleased that the Supreme Court of Canada was unanimous in upholding what we say is a forward-looking, innovative, and really reconciliation-based piece of legislation. The Act itself provides that legislative framework for our Métis governments to fully exercise their jurisdiction in child and family services. It is a right of Métis people to be able to take care of their children. It seems so simple that it should have just, it should have just passed. It should never have been challenged. But it was, unfortunately, as with many of our landmark Supreme Court decisions were challenged all the way up to the Supreme Court. This decision confirms that the federal government right now, it is on the right track to advancing legislation that affirms our rights that are protected by Section 35 of the Constitution, as opposed to denying them and always opposing them. And so we really welcomed this decision. The provinces, the federal government, individuals are always fighting us on what our rights are as Métis people, as Indigenous people in this country. They're fighting us on what our rights are about. But this piece of legislation, it affirms the need to work on a nation-to-nation, government-to-government basis. We talk about how this is legislative reconciliation, that we're moving towards recognizing and implementing our rights through legislation rather than through the courts, which is timely and it is expensive and it hits one versus the other. Instead of moving forward together on that nation-to-nation, government-to-government basis, where we work with the federal government to create pieces of legislation to implement and recognize our inherent rights as Indigenous peoples in this country. So, the decision from the Supreme Court on C-92 was a great step forward for us. We look forward to continuing down the path of negotiating the agreements with the federal government and our Métis governments to draw down jurisdiction for child welfare, so that we can bring our kids home and take care of them the way that we know how to do.
I don't know, would it be too unfair to say that it's almost as if the courts are the adults and the Parliament seems to be the children. They seem to feel, well, it's okay to pass things, but then that's just the beginning. And I don't know if that only applies to so-called enabling legislation, or it seems to be this get out of jail free term that says, okay, we'll work out all the regulations, afterwards, but we'll make an announcement and say, look what we did. And then it's unfortunate that so often it has to go to court. But now there's this other piece. So you talk about the nation-to-nation relationship, but we've also talked about self-government. And for the Métis, this is something that, again, goes back hundreds of years. The self-government, those who govern themselves, has been a term that was alive and well in Red River in the days of Louis Riel and well before that, in the days of Cuthbert Grant, who we touched on earlier as well. This particular legislation that's, I think, in third reading, that's about self-government in 3 particular jurisdictions. What's it going to do? What's its prospects in your view? How important is it? Tell us a little bit about it and your feelings about its likelihood of getting through.
Yeah, so Bill C-53 is extremely important in our pathway towards self-government as Métis people. I think what's the most important thing to always talk about here is that it's not new. It's not a new idea. Métis rights are not new. Métis self-government is not new. And the promise of Métis self-government legislation is not new. We've talked about the last 40 years and the progress that our leaders in the past have made, but then the promises that continue to be broken. Métis self-government has been talked about over the last 40 years, and we've inched closer to it, and then all of a sudden it's been taken away from us. Change of government, failed ratification votes, things like that, where it's out of our hands as Métis people. We are forced to have our rights recognized and implemented through systems that were not designed for us as Métis people. The federal government and the system that exists to pass laws in this country is a system that does not belong to us. So we talk about Bill C-53, and what that will do is it provides an anchor for Métis self-government to continue to move forward without us taking 3 steps backwards. Self-government has been talked about. The agreements have been signed with the federal government. This legislation will enable self-government. It will go to treaty negotiations following the passage of the legislation. Currently, Bill C-53 has been referred back to the House of Commons for third reading. So we're awaiting the day when the bill will go back to the House of Commons and pass third reading. What happens then is that it has to go through the Senate process before it receives royal assent and becomes law in this country. Bill C-53, like I say, it's going to help end what many people have been talking about for so long, and it was referenced in the Royal Commission on Aboriginal Peoples that, Bill C-53, it's going to end the inexcusable governmental handling of Métis rights over the years. So this really does put a pin in where we're at in our history right now and allows us to continue to move forward without taking 3 steps backwards. So we have some work left to do and to make sure that Bill C-53 passes, receives royal assent. But we're here in Ottawa. Métis National Council is supporting our Métis governments in getting this legislation passed, and it will be a significant moment in our history when it does pass.
Excellent. And that Royal Commission, I think, if I'm not mistaken, was called for by Prime Minister Brian Mulroney, who's now passed away, I think, in the wake of the Charlottetown Accords. So, isn't it remarkable how decades seem like a long time to a lot of us, but as I mentioned earlier, in the history, in the family history, and the great traditions of the Métis, decades are not a long time. Hundreds of years may be a long time. My last question for you, I'll just throw this one at you, that we have in this book. This cartoon, Lucy and Charlie Brown, that people would relate to. Lucy pulls the football away from Charlie Brown. A lot of people grew up watching Peanuts, older people in the colonial world of the suburbs and the TV sets, and watching and reading these books. But in our book, we have John A. Macdonald pulling the football away from Louis Riel. Are those days gone, or could that happen again? I'm thinking you feel a lot more positive as you describe. But it would be nice to think that that's not something that we're going to see again.
I sure hope not. Unfortunately, though, it could happen. Again, this is a system that does not belong to us, but we have been forced to work within for years, for generations. The passage of law falls to the 300 plus members of parliament who have been elected to represent every Canadian. And then, of course, we have our Senate process as well. So we have to navigate these systems to pass this piece of legislation. I am very hopeful that it will pass. It is the right thing to do. It will happen. We are closer than ever. We have been taking steps to build on the work of those who came before us. All of those folks who have come before me 40 years previous and generations before, Louis Riel, Gabriel Dumont, and Cuthbert Grant, thinking about all of those individuals who have dreamt of this for years. It will happen. When it happens, it will be very significant. And I always think about those who have come before me, and it's fascinating to always be able to look back on some of the, the YouTube clips from the constitutional conferences and, Jim Sinclair. What he did say, he talked about the right to land, the right to self-government, the right to self-determination. He says that those causes are right in any society. Those are the right things to do. I ultimately have faith in the systems that are before us to do the right thing. That is what is most important. And then, when that constitutional conference did end in failure, he said that we have the right to self-determination, self-government, and land. The people here are going to go back and continue to struggle. This is not an end. It is only a beginning. Our leadership has made a stand now. We break new roads for those who come in the future. And he said, don't worry, Mr. Prime Minister and the premiers of the provinces. I may be gone, but our people will be back. And I think about those words because when he references paving that road for us in the future, that's exactly what he has done. That's exactly what we continue to do today. I have absolute hope that C-53 will get through. And you know what? If it does not, we will be back.
So very well said. Thank you. Thank you so much for your time, President Caron. We've been speaking with the president of the Métis National Council, someone who clearly is as well spoken as Jim Sinclair all those years ago, and who will hear, no doubt, speaking with parliamentarians publicly again in the future. President Caron, thank you so much for your time.
Thank you very much.